Good evening, everybody. I'm Christine Mehring, Chair of the Department of Art History, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the second of our 3 Louise Smith Bross lectures of 2018, given by Milette Gaifman from Yale University. And before I hand over to my colleague Patch Crowley to introduce Milette, I wanted to say a few words about these lectures, which have been very generously endowed by the Bross family. And we're very happy to have John and Judy here tonight. And we are very, very grateful for their kind of visionary partnership with the department and the University of Chicago Press and the Art Institute in putting together this initiative with these lectures that have proven such an important addition to our department and so visionary also for our collaborations with the Art Institute, and we're very grateful for that. Louise Smith Bross was a PhD candidate in our department and received her PhD, in fact, in our department. And her passion, I am told, I unfortunately never met her, was pre-1800 European art. And the lectures, for that reason, usually revolve around a topic in this time period. We have had quite a lineup of lectures at this point that we're proudly looking back onto, as well as an offspring of this idea of these lectures, which are the Bross traveling seminars, which off and on we are able to make possible from these same funds. And I just want to give you a brief sense of just how exciting of an addition these traveling seminars and the lectures have been. We've had, I believe, 3 Bross traveling seminars. One was Rebecca Zorak taking students to Paris to explore what an archive is and doing archival work in Paris and all sorts of different archives in Paris. Another one was taught by Neil Atkinson on Florentine topographies, which took students to Florence. And then Aidan Kumler taught one on the medieval parish in England, which was now 3 years ago or so, Aidan, something like that. This has been a really wonderful addition, and again also has led to other types of traveling seminars that we've been making possible as well. The Bross lectures, as I mentioned, have a long history now as well, going back to the first one in 2000 that was given by Martin Kemp. These lectures also lead to publications with the University of Chicago Press, and you have Martin Kemp's book here, and Victor Stoikita was the next Bross lectures book is right here. Following lectures were given by Joseph Kerner, Sue Elcock, Stephen Campbell, and then 3 years ago, Jeffrey Hamburger from Harvard. And the lectures given by Stephen Campbell and Jeffrey Hamburger will be forthcoming as a book, I believe, by the end of next year or something around that. So please look out for a nice book party launch with Jeffrey and Stephen to celebrate that. And with that, I will hand over to Patch.
Thank you, Christine. So I'm Patch Crowley, and I'm delighted to introduce our speaker, Milette Gaifman, for the second installment of the Bross Lecture Series. Just to recapitulate for those of you who were not at the talk at the Art Institute on Friday, Milette took her BA at Hebrew University in Jerusalem in 1997, before going on to finish her PhD at Princeton in 2005, whereupon she took up a teaching position at Corpus Christi College, Oxford, before joining the faculty at Yale later that year. Most recently, she is the author of a sumptuously illustrated book, The Art of Libation in Classical Athens, published by Yale just this past year. Her first book, Aniconism in Greek Antiquity, published by Oxford in 2012, is, I think, for me, a historiographical tour de force that examines a difficult concept with aesthetic, anthropological, and religious stakes that forces us to look at old problems with fresh eyes. And just as the main theme of that book in many ways has to do with the ways in which ancient and modern classifications of images work to structure and define what counts as an experience of them. Milette guided us last Friday through the reception history of the monument of Lysicrates, a familiar monument in classical art history that I suspect she will characteristically make unfamiliar and strange to us by tomorrow evening. Please join me in welcoming her for tonight's talk, The Limits of Taxonomy. Thanks.
So thanks, everyone. Friday was really overwhelming. And I'm really delighted to be back. This series is a bit of a sonata structure. You know, the first movement is a bit joyful, the second a little more emotional, a little down, and tomorrow hopefully we'll get our spirits up. So be prepared to be a little more deep and emotive. Yeah. So there we go, as much as we can. So, and taxonomy, of course, has no limits. So there's my paradox of the title. But let us get back to the historiography, if you like, of the monument of Lysicrates. In the year 1762, London lovers of antiquity could feast their eyes, leafing through the impressive pages of the Antiquities of Athens by James Stewart and Nicholas Servet. This was the first in a series of 4 volumes published between 1762 and 1816. It was a sensation, the long-awaited results of the architects' arduous journey to Athens and the Greek islands, to which they set out from Rome in 1750 and returned to England in the beginning of 1755. This venture was funded by the subscriptions of the British lovers of antiquities, particularly members of the London club known as the Society of Dilettanti. These subscribers were promised in the proposal that was circulated already in 1748 that they would fund a publication of the great antiquities of Greece, but specifically Athens. For as Stewart explains in the introduction to the first volume, Greece is the mistress of the arts. Rome, the ancient city familiar to many of his subscribers, who traveled on the grand tour to Rome, is no more than Greece's disciple. Indeed, it may be presumed that all the most admired buildings which adorn that imperial city were but imitations of Grecian originals. Thanks to this publication by Stewart and Servet, lovers of antiquity who did not travel to Greece could now study the greatest and genuine examples of the classical past. In the opening pages of the first volume, James, the Athenian Stewart, as he has come to be known, further explained that the goals of the project were to measure and reproduce these antiquities as accurately as possible. And he and his fellow architect pursued their task tirelessly and meticulously so that others could become familiar with Grecian originals. Their painstakingly made drawings, plans, and elevations and cross-sections were also intended as models for artists and architects wishing to advance the arts through the replication of authentic ancient forms. The quest for genuine originals, the aim to provide first-hand records, and the great emphasis on comprehensiveness and accuracy speak to the wish to go beyond mere impressions or general accounts of the past, of the sorts that I talked about last week. Stewart and Servet's professed aim was to give a complete and precise account of Greek antiquities. Indeed, while no specific scientific claims are made in these pages, the attitude and strategies undertaken resonate with general 18th century developments in scientific exploration, and particularly British, one may say, Lockean empiricism. As far as the approach adopted to the actual monument studies, we find here some of the building blocks of what is to become the great enterprise of classical archaeology and the history of Greek art and architecture. As we shall see, the two 18th century travelers deployed strategies similar to those still used by modern-day scholars of classical art and archaeology. Today, Stewart and Servet's publication will serve as a point of departure for a consideration of the manner in which we study the works of ancient Greek and art and architecture, and how we will consider how primary classifications, whether of art forms such as architecture, sculpture, painting, or periods, late classical, Hellenistic, how these categories inform our knowledge and perception. We will do that by returning to the monument of Lysicrates, the monument which we have met already last week, that, as you may recall, celebrated the victory of the choral team sponsored by Lysicrates, a wealthy man in Athens in the 4th century BCE. Now, originally, the two architects promised their subscribers that the first volume would give a comprehensive account of the Athenian Acropolis with its famed monuments from the 5th century BCE, the height of classical antiquity. Upon their arrival to Athens, however, they met with numerous difficulties and could not accomplish the task as planned. Only later on, following a second trip to Athens, could they complete their mission to the Acropolis, which by then was serving the needs of its Ottoman occupants. A mosque stood at the heart of the Parthenon, and a garrison and a palace were also stationed there. These views of studies of the Athenian Acropolis were included in the second volume from 1788, seen here on the screen. The interest in the classical past is evident already in the volume's general plan of the Acropolis, shown here as it was construed to be in the 5th century BCE, without any of the later structures. So this is the plan of the Acropolis. Well, here you had the actual views of what they saw, and you could see the Parthenon with the mosque inside. This volume is often noted for the drawings of the Parthenon marbles, the Elgin marbles, before the removal by Lord Elgin to London and the British Museum, as it's shown here, as it is viewed by visitors today. Many of you have sure seen this, been in this room. So in the volume, we see, for instance, the corner of the west pediment or gabe of the Parthenon with a figure identified as the god Ulysses. And you see here what it is in the British Museum, and here is the drawing from Stuart and Rivette. Similarly, Stuart and Rivette show us and this is again from the monument itself in the 18th century. So on the left are their drawings from the south set of metopes, which show the struggle between the centaurs, those part men, part human, part horses, part men, and the Lapiths, this tribe of men that the centaurs attacked on an occasion of a wedding in which they got drunk. On the right, we see one of the metopes that is today in the British Museum. So you can get a comparison here of what their reproductions actually look like. Of course, the volume also contained the famous Ionic frieze with the famous central scene of the seaside. So here is the scene many of you are familiar with, and here is their rendition. But the explicatory text is also worth our attention, because for the first time we find in Stuart and Rivette the identification of the frieze as representing the Panathenaic procession, the most important Athenian festival in honor of Athena. The text also suggests that the object in the center of the scene, handled here and being transferred here between the child and the man, this object is the peplos. So they make first that suggestion. Here then, Stuart and Rivette open the door for an ongoing discussion that still haunts the discipline of Greek art, namely a debate about the Parthenon frieze. What exactly is represented here? Today, most scholars agree that the frieze subject somehow relates to the Panathenaic festival. That's how we mostly refer to it. Yet, because the imagery on the frieze does not really correspond fully with what we know of ancient realia of the Parthenon, of the procession in the 5th century BCE, for instance, not all groups that march march on the occasion of the Panathenaia. They're not all represented on the frieze. And there are lots and lots of these riders on horses, so that doesn't really make sense. There are ongoing contentions regarding the precise identity of the participants and what image of an Panathenaic procession is presented, whether it should be regarded as historic, idealized, contemporaneous, and there are various variations on these questions. And who is who? Given these ongoing difficulties, another less favored idea was proposed, namely that the frieze is about an Athenian myth related to child sacrifice. Within the heated discussion, much of the debate was dedicated to the question of the gender of the child, here shown in the central scene. Is it a boy or is it a girl? This in turn ends up being all about the exposed bottom. Is this an indication of a boy? Or could it be a girl, specifically because the figure, not so much in the reproduction, but it has these lines along the neck that are more commonly shown in female figures. This can get quite tiring, one could say, because they have numerous articles on that question, boy or girl. Yet the topic, and so this, especially in the late 90s, there was a sort of flux all of a sudden. Yet the topic continues, we can make fun of it, but it continues to receive attention. Witness in particular, the latest instantiation of this in John Conley's 2014 book on the Parthenon Enigma that was aimed at a broader public and garnered wide coverage in the press, in venues such as the New York Review of Books and the New York Times. The ongoing discussion speaks to a discipline so heavily concerned with knowing who is who, with identification and labeling. Effectively, we are still fascinated by the same questions that Stuart and Rivette sought to answer in the 18th century. Who is here? Who is represented? These issues are fundamental. They are important. Don't get me wrong. These are important questions. Yet sometimes, if we be a little careful, sometimes that fascination can become a little bit much, almost obsessive, we could say. And with that, we may ignore other aspects of ancient art. The interest in providing the proper label is also evident in Stuart and Rivette's first volume. So we were first going to deal with identification and labels, and then we will move on to thinking about taxonomies. This volume was the one published in 1762 and ended up including the monuments that were originally intended to be published in the second volume, but so they had to switch the order. Among them, the one that received the greatest number of plates, 26 in total, is the memorial for the choral victory of 3354 BCE of the team of boys sponsored by Lysicrates, which we've already met last week. Let us look closely now at Stuart and Rivette's account. First, the title. It is here that we find the introduction of the label choregic monument as it is known today. The opening remarks of the chapter, titled The Choregic Monument of Lysicrates, assert the significance of that designation. As they say, the modern Athenians call this edifice the Phanaritu Demostheneos, or the Lantern of Demosthenes. And if you were there on Friday, you heard about the whole history. So they call it the Lantern of Demosthenes. And the vulgar story, which says it was built by that great orator for a place of retirement and study, is still current in Athens, as it was in the time of Wheeler and Spon. As we saw last week, Wheeler and Spon were two travelers who also documented the monument in the 17th century and published it. But then the opening remarks continue. But like many other popular traditions, it is too absurd to deserve serious refutation. The point is very clear. There is no need to engage with undeserving folk tales enshrined in this common name. The freshly coined title is the correct one, as it describes the purpose of the edifice. The dismissive attitude towards Athenians of the day corresponds with a general view witnessed throughout Stuart and Rivette's work and resonates far beyond the 18th century. The contemporary local Athenians and the Ottoman occupants of the city are undeserving of any serious attention of the person wishing to gain proper grasp of antiquity. This folk tends to present more obstacles rather than help. Stuart makes explicit the aim of uncovering the past as it originally was. This wish to restore original purposes, and if at all possible, to the classical past is at its best, is all the more apparent in the volume dedicated to the Athenian Acropolis, which I started with, that, as he explained, treats the buildings erected while the Athenians were the free people, chiefly during the administration of the statesman Pericles. These lines articulate the impossible hope to return to that free Athens in the summit of classical antiquity. that Athens of Pericles, which is also shown in that plan that as they imagined it. Nothing later than that. The plates documenting the monument of Lysicrates also reveal the aim of shifting from the current uninformed perceptions to a properly documented and well-grounded empirical study. So the first plate depicts the monument within its 18th century environment. We see the circular structure incorporated within the building of the monastery. And here we have a different view than, I'll show you the other one that we've seen last week, but we have the interior of the garden where the monument was. And this is the monument, this is the Capuchin monastery, which was built there in the 17th century at the service of a French order residing in Athens. Here, in contrast to the image we've seen before on Friday, we see the interior. A monk sits peacefully. This is the monk in the monastery's garden, resting his eyes on a skull in a classic memento mori scene. A visual allusion to the man's religion and its commitment to the memory of human mortality. And potentially this could be seen also as a British view of what French religion and French Capuchins are like. They look at, the skulls. So there could be that layer too. In contrast, the rest of the plates are clear of such references to the 18th century. In fact, they're devoid of any context. First, we see a floor plan of the circular form with the dark parts referring to panels that were still standing, and then we have the lighter ones showing the panels that were missing. This is interesting if you're looking for reconstruction. They also note that the measurements of the diameter of the columns, and that the interior of the columns is not fluted and the outside is fluted. So their conclusion is that the monument was intended to be closed. Here we really see the beginning of thinking logically the way archaeologists still do. And then the monument is shown in its complete form without any structures around it. This is how it's presented in a way that was never encountered. They've never seen it like that. But that's how they present it, without any structures around it, in a way that they've never seen, as though it was standing on its own. It is accompanied only by the guides, and you have here we have a full view, and on the white page. And similarly, all other plates and plans and cross-sections are all made on a clean white page. And here you're going to also get all the measurements of all the bits and pieces of the monument. And here, too, we get the details. Now, this period is particularly interested in measurements and numbers and giving all the details. And these are beautiful architectural drawings. By removing the monuments from its 18th century context, these plates asserts the project's accuracy, giving them measurements, the concrete, the note on detail. There are no visions of an imagined Athens in the age of Lysicrates, Demosthenes, or Pericles in there. Rather, the plates are precise documentation devoid of any unempirical hypotheses. And Stuart writes that if anyone should find any errors, he takes full responsibility. He speaks like a modern scholar in that way. What is striking is the detail and of interest in every bit and piece in this illustration. The text preceding the plates elaborates the aim of the publication to provide explanation of the monument's original purpose and the subject of its frieze. The overall findings are summarized on the first page of the chapter, and at the very beginning they say the monument recorded the choregic triumph and supported the victory tripod on its roof. Its frieze was misidentified by earlier documenters. They don't use the term scholars, but they say documenters. And it depicts the story of Dionysus and pirates. So this is the first paragraph. Then follow a more thorough, detailed account that presents these assertions as the logical results of a close examination of the monument, one that is supplemented by the readings from ancient literature. The first crucial clue is the inscription, which names Lysicrates as choregos, or sponsor, the chorus of boys from the tribe of Achaemenses. The inscribed text is transcribed in full and then is coupled with broader account of the tradition of awarding tripods in antiquity. And that entire account is supported by references to ancient testimonia cited in footnotes. If this doesn't remind you of the kinds of things we read and do, then I don't know. This is a real transition between what we read before. Most significantly, these readings are accompanied by the careful examination of the roof, with its cavities suggesting that a three-legged object was placed there at the top. We have here the roof, so it's not complete, but they do talk about the places where a tripod could have actually been placed. Now, in fact, in the closing page, you have their mini reconstruction of that top of the monument. And in fact, until the 1970s, Stewart and Revette's text remained largely unchallenged. But there's, of course, and we are still interested in the question of the reconstruction of the tripod on the roof, and I've shown this comparison already on Friday, where we have Bauer's reconstruction, which adds here these two statuary figures in support of the tripod, or Amandri, who places the tripod directly on the roof. So they were engaging in questions that are still current today. Things get somewhat murkier if we start looking into the details of the plates of the actual frieze, where inevitably certain lacunae were filled in by the artist's own hands. And note the facial features here. Now here what I'm showing you are details from their representation of the frieze. And you see that I showed you the frieze goes around and they section it into small scenes. But here you see the dolphin, for instance, and here is a satyr attacking a pirate, where you could see the miserable, the satyr chasing the pirate, and there's a snake. At some point, subjective perception makes its way in. Moreover, the difference in approach presents the reliefs in sections without any measurements, without any of those guides. And we first get a first glimpse of a profound conceptual break between the sculptural aspects of the monument and the architectural ones. Imagery is, above all else, a narrative. It tells a story. The whole account is about identifying what's represented. Architecture is about function, and it's served here to support the tripod. Imagery can be shown and framed in nice drawings, architecture in plans and guides. The only one where you have the combination, and that's why I put it on the poster, and that's my favorite actually of all of these, is actually this drawing. So you know that they are aware that actually the frieze is part of the monument, and in that sense it is more holistic than other accounts. But that's the only place where we could see the frieze with the Corinthian column in this section. And so we have the frieze, and then the frieze below, and you get the Corinthian column, and even a part of a tripod right there, and all of this with the measurements. Criticism, and there could be many more. The whole enterprise deserves notice. The motivations to provide accurate documentation and explanation of the past led to a holistic approach of the monument in its entirety, one which considers all its elements together, the inscription, architectural members, and imagery. All of this is supplemented with external textual references, even if uncritically. Such an approach may be taken for granted as we see the things that we do today, or at least expected to do, a thorough, comprehensive account. But in light of previous accounts that we've seen last week, that's why I dragged you through that whole history, it tells you of a new approach to the study of ancient art, a meticulous investigation, epigraphic, archaeological, iconographic. Would it be an overstatement to call this an empirical or indeed scientific approach? Well, we can argue about that. I'll be happy to hear your thoughts, but at least for Hans Riemann, the author of the the entry on the Lysicrates monuments in none other than the Pauli Vesova, one of the Bibles of classical studies, the Real Encyclopedia of Altertumswissenschaft. So in the special supplement from 1956, he called that study the first scientific study of the monument. Here we then see the shift in approach, one which corresponds more or less with broader parallel developments in the histories of science. In addition, based on this close study, what emerged here is a new classification, a new category. We see the birth of the new word in the English language, choregic. And Pat, you're right, I am really interested in terms and categories. That goes back a long time. But the motivation was not to introduce a new category or concept, but once coined, it inevitably grew into a classification in the field of classics, Greek art, Greek archaeology. Effectively, Stewart and Rivette introduced a new idea, which now we can use in the field, in areas of research of culture, religion, by historians of Greek art and architecture. And it appears as an intuitive one and a sensible one. And indeed, we have numerous studies of choregic monuments, and as one might expect, a nice, heavy German catalog of griechische Weihgeschenke. Now, already the German title hints at the problems, and these you'll find with any category, of the problem with the slippery ends of this classification. There's the Weihgeschenk would be the votive offering, the dedication, rather than calling it a monument. Now, if we use the term dedication, we privilege a certain privileged role of these supports for tripods in the public space. But if we use and then we're not really talking about their size when we talk, as we do if we talked about monumentality. Yet some would argue, some historians of culture would say that such a title is an overstatement. If we want to be, some would say, I'm not saying that I am, but one of those, but some would say, well, on the monument of Lysicrates, which you're familiar with, there's no text that say this was dedicated to Dionysus. Does not say this is a gift to Dionysus, which is what you would expect from a Weihgeschenk. So they would say this does not apply here. And that maybe by putting, and it is, of course it appears in this volume without question. So once we put it in this category, we may ascribe to it something that wasn't actually there. Well, then you'll say, well, let's go for the appearance, the question then of the formal elements, and call these things monuments. And again, Stewart and Rivette didn't really contemplate these questions, but that becomes the exact problem of classical archaeologies. What are you going to call something like that? It's a base. It's from the 4th century BCE. It's got the inscription. We know it's choregic. You see that this is from Amandri, one of his accounts of tripods in Athens. So we know it was supportive of a tripod. Would you call this a monument, or would you just say you call it a base? This is not very monumental. Okay, then fine. But what do we do with something like that? This is a triangular form with figures in relief. We don't have actually the top, but we assume because of the form that this also supported a tripod. Is this a work of art? Is it a monument? Is it a base? Are these really important questions? I mean, why are you even leading us there? What do we do with columns and higher, taller bases? Where do we draw the lines, and when is a category helpful and when does it become unhelpful? I'm entering this debate because for some historians, they would draw the line between, they will call a monument when it's architectural, but they will not call this a monument because it's only a base. But then again, you could see how these lines can get very fuzzy. When does something become monumental? Is it because it's architectural? And if it's very tall, it's not. So you see how this can get a little almost silly. Another line of questioning would be about the term choregic. Is everything choregic? What are we doing with things that are not for the city Dionysia, for not the same festival, for which also there were dedication, people want tripods? I introduced one type, but there are others. Athens is filled with these kinds of bases for tripods of various forms. So we have, in a way, in the one hand, when we have these classifications, they're helpful, but we may end up having a hodgepodge of all kinds of things that may have had tripods on them, not always, that we call choregic monuments. And then you might start thinking, to what extent is this helpful? So this is the problem, you'll say, of classicists, of those who are interested in cultural history, not art historians. Thankfully, we have real categories. Well, I'm being a bit funny. I'm trying, at least. But at the heart of the issue is what constitutes a grouping whose shared common features are helpful for the organizations of our materials. Getting a better grasp of a phenomenon, a cultural one, a visual one, a material one. And here really one may think of trying to work with some of the work that's done in philosophies of science and the notion of natural kind. I'll be happy to talk about that later on. I'm not sure to what extent it's helpful, but it's a concept that's out there and may be applicable to some extent. But then the choregic monument is not purely, so choregic is not an art historical category, but then it is also part of the history of Greek art, we would think. And that question was certainly not one that preoccupied Stuart and Revett. They offered a title, they offered an account. But then what did we do if we want to place it in a broader chronology? To ordering their subjects according to categories of principle, whether of time, space, or formal category. Someone else did care about these questions, and that is, of course, Johann Joachim Winckelmann. In his Geschichte des Kunst des Altertums, whose first edition appeared in 1764, 2 years after the first volume of Antiquities of Athens, he claimed to provide a holistic account of art, Greek art. And in the opening lines, he said that he seeks to provide a Lehrgebäude for the study of art. Lehrgebäude is commonly translated as system, as in the example of the Mulgrave edition in the Getty series. And this is an accurate translation, as Catherine Harler and others have argued, because the word really captures its meaning in the 18th century context. And indeed, in another occasion, Winckelmann, in a footnote, uses Systema der alten Kunst as the equivalent of his Lehrgebäude. But it's noteworthy that Lehrgebäude has the root of Lehr, learning, and Gebäude, building. So in a useful metaphor to think with is a structure with rooms and floors where artworks can be placed. So where was the choregic monument of classical Athens within Winckelmann's art history? Presumably, you would think that the author who sought to give a complete account of the noble art of the Greeks based on originals, as much as possible, and to describe the rise and fall of that most noble art, would have great interest in a monument from the age of Athenian democracy. Even if this grand his history hardly dealt with architecture, surely he could have had some interest, or at least in that relief. Interestingly, the monument is not mentioned either in Winckelmann's first edition from 1764, nor is it in the later posthumous edition, expanded version from 1776. How come? Well, perhaps Winckelmann didn't know about this monument. After all, he never set foot in Greece, so he couldn't have seen it. And as we saw, it was never described by ancient authors. And one of his main sources was text. Yet he could have known about it, and he probably did. For there were recent publications he had access to. In fact, we know that he saw the first volume of Stuart and Revett's Antiquities of Athens. In a letter to his good friend Henry Fuseli from 1764, Winckelmann mentions the book. But it's clear that I was sort of giving you great praise. Well, Winckelmann was not a fan. He says that this is a very large book for small things, Kleinigkeiten. And he concludes his dismissive impression. This is a very short paragraph because it's not worth more than that. He quotes from Virgil's description of the Cyclops, Polyphemus, calling the volume Monstrum Horrendum Ingens qui lumen ademptum, an immense, horrible monster deprived of light. Well, it's curious to see his impression, but what we also get here is the selection process in Winckelmann's thought, one which we also see in later histories, of what ought to be part of the grand Lehrgebäude and what is just small things that need not be included, Kleinigkeit, what is considered integral to a history of art, and what remains outside. Still, there was another source that Winckelmann was far more receptive to, and also included the monument of Lysicrates. This was the ruin section where he talks about the Lehrgebäude, and this is from the first edition. And here he could have read, and he did read. We know that Les ruines des plus beaux monuments de la Grèce, the most beautiful ruins of Greece, published in 1758 by Julien Leroy, who also traveled to Athens. And unlike the two British travelers, he had better connections, so he managed to, in very short time, to actually get the documentation of the entire city and its monuments, including the monument of Lysicrates. This French volume had a far broader scope than its British parallel, but it's the first volume, but it was far less scientific or accurate. Leroy's opus was divided in two parts, whereby the first has the monuments are considered in what he called a historic context, discours historique, and in the second within an architectural context. What that actually means, that sort of, you think when you read the titles, you think, oh, he's going to talk about the great history of things. It actually becomes apparent when you reread the treatments of his subject. In our case, the monument of Lysicrates appears in both sections. The illustration here on the left, which you've seen before, is part of the historic account. The one on the right is one of the architectural account. In the historic account, the monument is described as the lantern of Demosthenes. And he also tells you that it's likely that Demosthenes himself was involved in its building. It's the creation of this monument. In the second part, the architectural part, shown here on the right, the monument is illustrated on a clean page on its own. It does certainly have resemblances to the take of Stuart and Rivette, but once you start looking more closely, you see some inaccuracies. These tripods, for instance, are far longer than the original. More than that, if here it's the lantern of Demosthenes, the second half presents the monument as the temple of Hercules. And in the architectural part, it is also part of the whole section on round temples. So what we see here is the reason why Leroy is so notorious for his inaccuracies and garnered so much animosity especially from the two British architects who saw him as their rival. And reading the footnotes is just fabulous. They go at each other. Just go for it. And it's just terrific. It feels like you're home. So for this, you really would, and all the account of Robin Middleton in the Getty who edited the publication in the Getty series is really helpful in getting an idea on that. What's interesting then, that even though this is the less scientifically accurate account, that one was actually, that Winckelmann actually, even though he criticized it, he used it, he referred to it in his own work. And we can think of Winckelmann being more of a Francophile in his thinking and also looking for larger stories, grand schemes of things than these Brits who are going there and measuring bits and pieces and being obsessed with Kleinigkeiten. But if we're going back to the Winckelmann question, if he was looking at this, he would not have he wouldn't have cared much of that relief. And he would say, well, this is just architecture. And my history has nothing, is really mostly about painting and sculpture, and architecture is not that essential. So I may not mention it at all. It's one way of reconstructing Winckelmann in 1764. Of course, I'm hypothesizing. But what we get here is what we get to is the primary distinctions in art history, that separation between painting, sculpture, and architecture. Now, it is so profound and has such deep histories, go all the way back to antiquity, that we cannot even question it. That long tradition of treating architecture separately from painting and sculpture. But our example, in fact, illustrates the consequences of that divide as we follow the treatment of the monument of Lysicrates in various histories of Greek art and architecture in the course of the 19th and 20th centuries. Now, first we should note that the monument does appear in one of the later editions of Winckelmann's history, those that appear in the 19th century. Even though it was not included in the original editions, neither one, in the 19th century, some editors felt they need to put it in the footnotes. But where would we put it? And here I read to you from the translation by Henry Lodge. This appeared in 1850 in the English edition of a 19th century German publication that was published in Dresden in 1812. And here, the monument is said to be of the time of Praxiteles because its date corresponds with the years that Pliny gives us for Praxiteles, the great artist of the 4th century BCE. And I skip some and I'll read to you. We can form an opinion as to the bas-reliefs only from engravings, and they refer to Stuart and Revett. But even with so imperfect copies before us, we do not fail to see that the style of the work is admirably beautiful and at the same time noble. In regard to invention, the work also satisfies its purpose, that of adorning frieze, which it does with so much spirit, versatility, taste, and skill, that it may stand as a model and be regarded as entirely worthy of the age from which it proceeds. Here, then, the monument of the Lysicrates become exemplary of the sculptural works of the age of Praxiteles and original of the 4th century BCE. Now, the focus then shifts from the monument to the relief as an original work of sculpture. Now, in the move from Winckelmann original's text to the 19th century edition, we witness move from these high spirits to the need to actually build that Lehrgebäude and fill it up with all kinds of all the things that we find. And it could be seen as part of a broader process, which Suzanne Marchand described as the process of institutionalization and bureaucratization of the discipline, with the rise of whole sets of classifications and typologies. A time in which Winckelmann Lehrgebäude came to be divided and subdivided and populated with vast finds from archaeological sites and museums collections. Now, this process must be seen in context. For how should anyone cope with the vast range of objects, artifacts, or architectural remains that are all investigated under the rubric of ancient Greek visual culture, especially when you think about the 19th century with ongoing archaeological works and great excavations? Thankfully, we need these taxonomies, and we can organize various architectural forms and elements into various rubrics and typologies. And we even possess ancient texts, such as Vitruvius's De Architectura, that provide us with the proper, authentic, ancient terminologies and categories of classification. This way, not only can we identify Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian orders, but we also can delineate developments, note changes in proportions, chronological and geographical variations, schools, and types. Similarly, Greek pots can be organized according to shapes and techniques. We can move then from just numbering to having proper names. Here we again must note that already in antiquity there was an interest, at least by some, in the namings of shapes and usages of particular class of pots, namely drinking implements. The Greek author, writing in the late 2nd century CE, Athenaeus, the author of the Deipnosophistae, or the Banquet of the Sophists, included in his grand opus a whole catalog of cups organized alphabetically. Yet, if you read this catalog, it soon becomes apparent that it is impossible to match all the various pots described in his book with the kinds of pots we actually find across the ancient Mediterranean. And in fact, when I read that text, and I have done that many times, it seems like Athenaeus is more playing with the categories and the names, and he was already writing quite late in the history, than he's actually trying to provide a real catalog. So it's more of a game of names than a naming. So typologies and taxonomies catalogs can be funny or culturally interesting. We certainly use today ancient Greek words to classify our pots, and while some of the names of shapes used today correspond with ancient language, for instance, when you say fiale, the libation bowl, it normally corresponds with the ancient way of using that word, or the lekithos, the oil flask. In many cases, these are complete fictions of the 19th century, the pelike, for instance, and they are a product of the 19th century own decision-making process. Here I'm showing you one page. This is from Eduard Gerhard's publication for the Berlin Museum, where he was deeply, this is a great scholar, one of the greatest scholars of classical archaeology. The 19th century, was involved in the founding of the Deutsche, what was to become the Deutsche Archaeologische Institute, the German Archaeological Institute. And he was deeply involved and engaged in the question of what to name the various shapes. I'm showing this page because here we see what he calls a kelebe, which today we would call a column crater. So there are some names that used to be there in the 19th century, very learned, and now no longer there. So there's shapes and names of shapes are one way of classifying pots, and of course we cannot talk about pots and classifications without mentioning Sir John D. Beazley and his system of organizing, of identifying and attributing pots to their makers by his system of attribution. So we have the rise of these kinds of typologies in various aspects, including, I've focused here on architecture and painted pottery, but that also comes into sculpture. Indeed, as we saw, the monument of Lysicrates appears in the rubric under the rubric of Greek sculpture already in the edition of Winkelmann's 19th century, the 19th century edition of Winkelmann's work, where, as we saw, it is associated with Praxiteles. And later on, in the course of the 19th century, we see in the more detailed histories that appeared in that time, those that go beyond Winkelmann's kind of mirage-like structure, or those that are really engaged with an empirically grounded work. Well, here we also find the monument of Lysicrates. What I'm showing you here on the screen is there is the frontispiece of Johann Adolf Overbeck's his edition on Greek sculpture, Grecian plastique, from 1857. This is one of the major textbooks on Greek sculpture of the 19th century. And on the right, we see the relief as it is appearing there. You see that at the top, we have the inscription, and then the relief, instead of being, there's no reference to the fact that it was actually circular. You just see it as a whole set of these plates, one below the other. The text gives, the imagery first, it treats it as an illustration of the story that I told you about, the transformation of the pirates into dolphins, and concludes, so first there's an iconographic identification, which is accompanied by the necessary references to, for instance, the Homeric hymn to Dionysus. And then it concludes with locating it in its particular area in particular historic moment, namely the age of Praxiteles. So even though we do not know who is the maker and who is the artist of the Lysicrates monument, because of its date and because it's original, it becomes its own illustration of the great art in the age of Praxiteles. This is not just the legacy, this is not just something that you see in the 19th century, but you could see a similar approach in which the frieze of the monument of Lysicrates is treated on its own in textbooks of the 20th century as part of the legacy of the Periclean era. Now this separation of the relief for the monument has to be taken again in another context, and that's the way people actually studied this material, and that through the process of plaster casts, which were made early on in the 19th century. In fact, Herbert Ducou had a very important article in 1893 where he argued against a lot of other publications that they misunderstood, that they misplaced the relief because they used the wrong, the plaster casts were misleading. That is also something that impacts reproduction, and here I love this. This is from Goethe's house in Weimar, and here you see they decorated the house with a part of the same relief. I hope you can see that here. It's not a very good slide. And actually, Goethe himself has a response, and he talks about the dolphins the pirates transforming into dolphins, and he actually says that they are being saved by Dionysus as they're being transformed into dolphins. So it even generates poetry. Now, the association between the frieze and Praxiteles in this history is not surprising given the date and the fact that Pausanias, the travel writer that I spoke about on Friday, mentions Praxiteles in his account of the Street of the Tripods, where he says there are great works of art here, namely one of them is a statue of a satyr by Praxiteles. But such an association can have even further consequences in the history of art, as the relief have come to be used within a more specific subset of categories, those generated by the field of copying critique, the study of Roman copies of lost Greek originals, whose primary concern is the reconstruction of the lost statues that have not survived. This is mainly in the world of sculpture. Here we are looking at the identification of a particular type, typically sculpture in the round, but one which can cut across various media. In our case, the statue type known as the pouring satyr is listed here in one of the Roman copies, one of many replicas that were interpreted by Adolf Furtwängler as Roman copies of some lost Greek original by Praxiteles. That was Adolf Furtwängler in the late 19th century. In the 20th century, the satyrs of the frieze of the monument of Lysicrates, particularly the one here holding up, holding the bowl and having what appears to be a jug. Now this has become something that is either inspired or a replica of that lost original of the pouring satyr, presumably by Praxiteles. And that comes, so we get bits and pieces that with the attempt to get that replica from this and other reliefs. But the Lysicrates monument is key here in that argument. So this is within the history of sculpture where the relief can then serve other purposes in creating a typology and reconstructing a particular type. A somewhat different perspective comes to the fore in histories of architecture, where the relief is mentioned only in passing. See, so far we haven't talked much of the architecture, but much of the discussion is dedicated to the monument's circular form and especially the Corinthian columns, because here they are witnessed for the first time on the exterior of a building in the history of architecture. And I purposely did not stress that so much, but that is actually the obsession of architectural historians. Those Corinthian columns, first time seen on the exterior of a building. And on this, I'll read to you from the translation, the Gettin translation of Gottfried Semper, who is one of the most interesting writers on architecture in the 19th century. And those of you who read Riegel, I know Yash Elsner was here. Riegel he deals with Semper a lot. And there's a reason why he actually engages with him, even if there's a rejection. There was a reason, there was a point there because Semper was such an influential figure. In his work on style, he writes, among the surviving early Corinthian works, none is as important and as instructive as the choregic monument of Lysicrates in Athens. The physiology of this order, this is the Corinthian order, can be so clearly read here that it appears to be, so to speak, a lapidary treatise on the subject. It may well be that its creator had something of that sort in mind. In other words, from Semper's point of view, the Lysicrates monument is the innovation, brings out the idea of the Corinthian column on the exterior. A similar assessment you will find in 20th century histories of Greek architecture, such as A.W. Lawrence, where it comes to stand for the deployment of the Corinthian column on the exterior structure. Now, arguably, that kind of division which I've described here between sculpture and architecture is fully justifiable. That the architectural historian will focus on the Corinthian column, while the historian of sculpture will focus on the relief and try to connect it with Praxiteles, makes a lot of sense. What is noteworthy, though, is the continuation of this approach in more detailed accounts of the monument itself, where we have one study that focuses on the architecture and the other on the relief, and they don't talk to each other. And the text that is completely not interesting, because epigraphists would look at it, and they would look at it as part of the histories of choregic monuments. Those tripods that I've shown you, right here, we'll come back to that. So the tripods here get completely lost in the mix. They are not really interesting. They're not figural, they're not about sculpture, but so they're not of interest for the historian of Greek sculpture, and they're not really interesting for the historian of Greek architecture because there's nothing innovative here. So what happens is then the things get pulled apart. Interestingly, one of the more interesting or comprehensive, at least, discussions of the monument come from the perspective of cultural historians, such in particularly Peter Wilson's discussion of the monument in his account of the Choregeia, that institution of sponsorship of choruses in performances in classical Athens. But then again, he's treating it from a cultural historian's perspective rather than anything visual. The upshot is that as if our primary art historical categories inevitably forced us to view and think of two separate elements as almost distinct and unrelated, and other parts completely gone. Element is there's that of assessment. When the monument's relief is assessed in its own within the histories of sculpture, then it's the age of the heyday of Praxiteles. It's high art still. It's the spirit of a lively spirit of the age. The same monument, however, may be viewed quite differently when seen from the perspective of the history of architecture. Here I quote from Lawrence's account. The monument of Lysicrates, of course, is a folly, and no building intended for practical use can have been so whimsical. It may, in fact, be legitimately described as Baroque. Now, Baroque is, of course, a way of saying this is not good, this is not high classical art. So for Lawrence, the monument is already a marker of that Hellenistic era. This kind of schizophrenia between the perspective of the greatness of Praxiteles and the horrible Hellenistic doom that is around the corner is interesting, especially in the context of where we have the actual date, 3354 BCE. But as I spoke about on Friday, this is exactly the time when Alexander the Great comes to power, and an ultimate moment before Athenians lose their freedom. So we are at a turning point in history, if you like. And it's precisely that allows you to say about the same monument it's high or low, or so it could be late classical, or proto-Hellenistic. What are we going to do with this? And this is, even if we agree that it's basically still late classical, after all, it is still within the remits of classical Athens with democratic institution, it is not really a building, as it was not meant for regular entry, you could say. It's not a statue, even though it is on a tall base, like statues, and it may have actually housed a statue. Well, you may just say, well, this is just a very, very interesting base for a tripod, going back to the discourses of the 4th century BC. But then, aren't we missing the point of all of this? Some scholars just raise their hands, calling it the enigmatic choregic monument of Lysicrates, before moving on to talk about other things. And there's another scholar, this is about the description of the account of the rise of the Corinthian column. And another scholar, here I'm quoting, said it cannot even be argued that it reflects contemporary tendencies in architectural sculpture, since the monument is not a canonical temple or a civic structure, but a private offering by an individual that might have required a theatrical narrative. Well, I hope that in light of everything I spoke about Athens of the 4th century BCE, you could see that it's very hard to say that this is just a private, crazy, whimsical thing of narrative needs. It had to do with something of society, and it was in the public space. Then, obviously, there's a great discomfort here. But perhaps rather than calling the monument a misfit, we need to rethink at least some of the lenses which we use to look at it, the particular classifications we use in our inquiry. So where have I gone here today? The process of taxonomizing helped us organize the material and gain better grasp, to build a great structure of learning, a Lehrgebäude. But it has also led us to the dissection into bits and pieces of our objects of study. Not physically, of course, but conceptually. Of focusing on certain things and completely ignoring others. We look at relief separately of the structure. We try to fit things within a typology. If all of this sounds kind of negative and gloomy, please do not despair. There's a 3rd chapter coming around tomorrow. On the contrary, I want us to keep that structure. It's a very helpful one. But there is a way in which perhaps we can find passageways between those different floors and rooms and try to connect them in various ways, and also connect them to the landscape in which that monument actually stood, and try to tie it up to the topography of the city of Athens of the 4th century BCE. And with that hope, I hope you'll come back tomorrow for the final round. Thank you.
In their own work. So can you help me just...
Sure. I mean, I think the plan of the Acropolis of the 5th century, their plan of the Acropolis is where you have a sort of, there's only 3 buildings there, is where you could see that they really try to bring it back. That's where they'll give you the clean of today. So that cleansing of the current situation, which then is echoed also with these clean pages with only measuring, whether only column capitals and models of for copying. At the same time, absolutely, I mean, these things go together. And in their work, they're doing, so they both want to, if it were only a manual, then you would have only the plates. Then you wouldn't even care to say whatever it is that the Athenians are saying today is useless, if it were only that. They're doing both. And that because they say, and that's why I emphasize that opening remark, to say what they're saying is that this is the lantern of Demosthenes doesn't make sense. They want to think about this empirically. So there's that dimension. And there's the dimension that to get good art, you copy this, and I'll provide you with the manual. And these things I don't think they're contradictory. They supplement each other. So there is the pragmatic and practical, and they're British. They work, you get the best measurements you can have at the same time. And within that same line, if we're going to copy it, we need to know what we're copying, I would think, and what was its original purpose, and clean up that nonsense of today. So that would be my, yeah. And the tripods, they're mentioned, yeah. Right.
But it's certainly sculpture as well, right?
Yeah, but that doesn't get discussed at all. I mean, they're actually some of the few that, and again, that's why I emphasize in my conclusion that even within the most comprehensive German detailed accounts, you get the drawings of the tripods. He'll tell you which ones are originals and which ones are not. That you'll get to learn, but not more than that. So there's no real discussion of what they do there, actually. That's why actually on Friday I showed like some later copies of the monument, especially the one from 1771, which is based on Stuart and Rivet. So you get, and it's, in a way there's a parallel with Winkelmann himself, where you have the first, the Gedanken, which is meant for artists. Yeah. This is how we artists do, and then we have the Lehrgebäude, which is what our history should be. And there's a transition then there's a shift in the Winkelmann, but the two, Stuart and Rivet are not really, they're interested in labeling. Now, from my perspective, label is the first step for taxonomy. Mm-hmm. And here I'm very Foucauldian, I'm upfront with it. But if I don't have the title, I don't even know what to do with it. Once I have the title and once I've identified the purpose, then I'm going to put it somewhere in some rubric. And what's interesting is that they're doing both. They're in a way opening a path for all kinds of copies, replications, and at the same time, we have what you would call constrictive. I think what I read on Friday, from the Gromont, the manual about architecture, where he cites so here we have the taxonomy coming into play into instructional texts for architects. Mm-hmm. And so we can use the taxonomy, which is in a way based on organizing data from the past, in order to create new forms in the world of the Beaux-Arts school, which is one that actually will take all kinds of things. But from their perspective, it's interesting that, the Lysicrates appears there as the Corinthian order, mm-hmm. as it appears also with Regal. It's there too. And part of that, too, so from their perspective, we'll use that scientific Lehrgebäude and then can incorporate it within new creative taxonomies that move forward. And that would be within the kinds of things like the Beaux-Arts school, which would actually have pretty strict rules, if you like. So it's a very interesting dynamic. I don't think they're contradictory. I think they feed into each other. And what's so interesting in this period that actually they're in conversation with each other. And the other conversation would be the changes in scientific thought that also appear here. So we are in a huge crossroad culturally.
But also just the profound problem posed by taking a first.
Yes.
And trying to make it your type specimen.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, in a way, I launched into that choregic because it's sort of funny to see that they coined it without thinking, and then we now have someone saying, well, if it's not this, then if it's architectural, it's monument, and if it's not, then it's... So they were not thinking those terms at all. We are. Yeah. Yeah. So in some ways, yes. I mean the story. I mean, I opened up with the Panathenaic frieze to show here is something that we're still dealing with today, and that starts right there, and you can even give it the date. Another aspect, and it sort of relates to both these points, and thanks so much, this is really helpful, is the plaster cast, the copy, and I emphasize that, but I don't know if it was clear. I mean, the idea of having plaster cast that Yale has a set, you start digging a little somewhere, all of a sudden there's a set of plaster casts of the Lysicrates monument, at least the relief. The monument as a whole is much harder to replicate. So you'll get most people will have plaster casts, some people, institutions, and that's where you can also see it within histories of sculpture, and then it can go into all the copying critique, which is also based in that. So yes, and they're doing it in a way in the same time and in the same spirit. Yes, I'd say it doesn't, because the whole thing stands as a whole. But one thing is that it's closed, and there are those who would say it should have been open. Okay, so that's part of that story. And it doesn't have so it's not a full reconstruction. It does not attempt to give you a full account of what it was. So it's really much more of a conceptual break. That's why I emphasize the conceptual rather than the physical. The physical is this, and then the physical would be various copies. Now, the copies certainly get separated in very clear ways. And architectural copies of them, and there are numerous. I've yet, typically you'll have either the circular structure and the Corinthian columns, and it's variations on that theme, and I've shown that on Friday. And the relief will be replicated as its own subject elsewhere. It does get that. So the physical, this is where you get the physical pulling apart. Conceptual is when you get the literature and the study of the monument. What happens is that if you have Stuart and Rivette and you want to reconstruct it, you can't just say, oh, I'm going to do this separately and that. You put it all together as one whole. So it still remains as a whole monument. Yeah. You want to poke at it. And I'm not being committal, because I think, and again, my criticism is not too much of I don't begrudge, I see them as actually being very creative. And I kind of feel that they don't get enough credit, Stuart and Rivette, for instance, even though they're already doing some pulling apart with their different treatment of the relief from the monument. I do begrudge the more recent scholarship, which does have and still tends to separate things. And I'm not talking about histories of sculpture or histories of architecture, but accounts that attempt to give you a full comprehensive view of whatever this is, and that gets stuck on stuck within the same parameters of. That's really where I'm going at. In other words, we even lost the generative creativity that you get in Goethe's house. If you want, that would be my answer to that. At least and he's creating a new world, and he's reinterpreting the frieze, the narrative of the frieze in an almost Christianizing way. So this is really I actually am happy also with thinking about these things working together, not as contradictory, as something that is both a model and scientific, whatever it is, or taxonomic, or laying a groundwork for taxonomies later on. That's, I'm building up, and then everyone will be so disappointed. It's terrible. I'm sorry. So I shouldn't say, no, you're right. I have no idea. Forget it. I'm giving you this. Doom and no.
And if there's thoughts on polychromy.
Okay, so polychromy is a difficulty, is a big problem, and I know that. In the Crystal Palace, so that before Chicago, there was a reconstruction that was so polychromic that there was a whole debate whether it should be painted or not. So there's a whole question. Now, Stuart and Rivette don't talk about polychromy there, but it immediately, Zemper, for instance, cites this as a polychrome building, for instance. So they're thinking about it in terms of polychromy, but as far as I know, there was no evidence for that. For real, I may have missed some line on that, but you could see that there is color just because there are different kinds of marble. So we can assume polychromy, I think it'd be right, and even without that, we could see that there's a vibrancy just in terms of different colorations of stones.
We have time for one.
Yeah. The text in Stuart and Rivette are Stuart's, basically. He's writing it. And it's his studies, as far as I know. So, and the problem there is that, their process of work, what you're actually asking about is the process of working. And who did the drawings, and because there are different hands that you can detect there, and how they actually worked with that. So all I can have is the or at this point, I can see the end results where there is some correlation. For instance, if you think, I mean, I'm now talking about Stern and Rivet, when you're thinking about the discussion of the relief, of the frieze, it is really in terms of identifying what, so then it makes sense to have just these, we're not really interested in, I mean, the forms are just, here is an illustration of a dolphin, of a pirate turning into a dolphin, here is a satyr attacking a pirate, etc. And here we have also Dionysus reclining. So there is a correspondence that you could see in a general approach to these things. And also in thinking about the monument as architecture, whether versus the relief as telling a story.
And with that, I
Yeah.
think we have a response.